My goal in doing these videos is always the same. I want to try to convey to you some helpful insights, some understanding that will increase your appreciation for God's reality around us and for how you interact with that. I like to think of these conversations as me kind of just sitting at a picnic table, having a talk with you about things that are interesting, or maybe just talking just in casual conversation about what's going on and seeing it from a theological perspective. So there's always depth and intricacy underneath the things I'm saying, and I sometimes will oversimplify, but that's because I'm trying to make things easily enough to grasp or to kind of comprehend, not trying to be exhaustive. So just kind of keep that in mind as I share some thoughts here. Because I want to talk to you today a little bit more about Christian nationalism. Now, I know I've talked about this in a couple of podcasts at the seminary, through the Tangible podcast, and I've been thinking about this a great deal, but I want to clarify a few things and help sharpen a few things, because I'm convinced we're going to be hearing a lot more about Christian nationalism and the influence of the church on government policy and thinking, especially in light of what's been going on with the recent developments in the Republican Party. I've been watching the last few nights the Republican National Convention, and now that Senator Vance from Ohio has been nominated as the vice presidential pick on the Republican ticket for this fall, I can guarantee you we're going to be hearing even more about Christian nationalism. And that's the case because Senator Vance has made very clear that some of the influences on his own thinking are Patrick Deneen, Rod Dreher, and Yoram Hazony. I've not read everything these men have written, but I have read books by each of these guys, at least one, a couple of books in several of the cases, and gotten to know them a little bit. Sometime I might be able to go into depth on their thinking a little bit more and some things that are interesting about each of those gentlemen. I've enjoyed reading their material, have definitely some thoughts about each of them. But for today, I think I'll stick to simply trying to help you understand why it is that a Christian should have a little ambivalence toward some of the enthusiasm we're encountering lately all about this new Christian emphasis on our politics. We just need to be a little bit careful how we think about this and how we respond to this. It calls for a little bit of wisdom, I think, in how we jump on board with, there's a man who's a proponent for Christian values, he's our guy, this is great. Now, I do like a candidate who stands for God's truth. No doubt about that. That's a very good thing. That's a right thing. But we need to be a little bit careful in how we understand what is our goal. And perhaps that's the best way to approach this. It's good to kind of back up again a little bit and just start and reassess and reassert what are the distinct goals of God's work in the right-hand realm of the church and God's goal in the left-hand realm of the state or the government. I know I've covered these things, but I want to hit this one more time to be very clear on this. It has been said that the definition of Christian nationalism is the idea that America is a Christian nation and we should work to try to keep it that way. Now, that's a very simplified definition, and there are other ways of defining it that are more defined or more detailed or a little more sophisticated, but that one works well enough. So on the face of it, you might say, well, what's wrong with wanting a Christian nation? I've covered that in a previous video. Check that out. So I won't revisit all that now. But I do want to revisit the idea of what are the goals of each. And the idea of a Christian nation, what does that even mean? What are we trying to strive for? So the basic teaching in Scripture, I would contend, is the one that is expressed by Lutheran theology, that we are thinking of God's work in the world in two distinct realms, the realm of the left and the realm of the right. Remember, the goal of the realm of the right, the church, is the proclamation of the gospel and encouraging people to follow Christ. That's the goal, to live following Christ, proclaiming the gospel. So what's the goal on the left hand, the realm of the world around us, the realm of the state? The goal there is very simple. It is to uphold God's justice, which means fighting and resisting evil and stopping what is evil. That's why the government has the sword, and working to support and care for the least and the marginalized and those who are downtrodden, giving compassion and care and mercy to those who are in need. That is the job of the state as well. So This is the kind of the tension here. Essentially, the state is holding things together in a world that has been fractured and shattered by sin, while the work of the church is to proclaim the gospel into a world fractured by sin and give the ultimate solution, which is Christ, and help people to live forward to that day when Christ comes and returns and makes all things new and whole. In the meantime, these two realms work together and side by side, but always distinct from each other. When they start getting blended together, things get really messed up. And they can get blended together in so many ways. One of the things that's interesting about some of these authors I mentioned, like Deneen and Dreyer, is they both have these kind of inclinations and intonations, which without coming out outrightly in favor of something known as integralism. And integralism is the idea that the church and the state should be blended together in such a way that the state actually is subsumed under the church. This is kind of the old Roman Catholic idea that the church is the ultimate reality and everything else fits underneath it, so the state should be doing the bidding of the church. That's kind of the bottom line of integralism. It's getting a resurgence of interest, sometimes muted without the explicit Roman Catholic overtones to it, but it's there. And Deneen is leaning in that direction, so does Dreyer lean in that direction, even though Dreyer's now gone over to Orthodoxy. There's still this sense of the church is the final authority and all things should be fitted underneath that. Yes, Christ is the final authority, but we know from Scripture that Christ himself said, "My kingdom is not of this world," and we know from other things that is taught in the New Testament that the state is here to hold things together until Christ returns. Until then, we should always expect there to be a confrontation and a uneasiness in this world. Even the Reformed or the evangelicals or the Protestants fall into this trap when they get into the idea of the work of transforming the culture into a Christian culture. That's not explicitly the goal of the church. We're not trying to create a Christian government or a Christian world this side of the eschaton or the return of Christ. That's the tension we need to hold. Lutheranism has always been very good at holding that tension. We need to make sure we keep on holding that tension and not lose it by becoming excited about making a new Christian push back into the world or trying to stop what is the erosion of morality in the name of Christianity, which is all good to stop the erosion of immorality, but don't think you're bringing Christ into the world today in a kind of realized eschatology or a post-millennial idea even of here comes the Christian kingdom even now. That's not what we're about. What we're about, bottom line, is this. We want the world to be upholding God's justice. So yes, I get excited about candidates who are upholding God's morality, fighting for the things that uphold God's truth, and are pushing back against the things that erode and compromise God's plan for his creation and God's justice, which is fighting against what is evil as God defines it, and not caring for those who are marginalized or who are being overrun by the elites in the world and those who have power and the misuse of power. Government should do those things. And a candidate who upholds that is a good thing. On the other hand, we need to be always tempered in our enthusiasm, recognizing that this stuff is always piecemeal and it's always doing what we can to put a band-aid essentially on the wound until Christ returns and makes all things new. And it will never be other than that until Christ returns. Even Luther, 500 years ago, writing from a Christian nation, Germany was as Christian as it gets, the whole world, whole Europe was Christian. Even he had no interest in trying to have a Christian government. He was extremely skeptical of any ability of any prince ever to be truly a Christian. And Luther had some really good princes who were good Christian men leading. And even then, Luther was skeptical. He said, you don't want to have a Christian nation or try to rule the world with Christian principles. That's not the goal. The goal is God's justice being upheld. So if Luther was skeptical of ever having a Christian nation, how much more so should we be skeptical today? We need to be tempered in what we're shooting for, tempered in our enthusiasm, and always recognizing that the real goal of our Christian faith is to follow Christ. And this leads me to my final and perhaps my most important comment I want to make. There are times, especially nowadays, and I'm seeing this in the authors I was just mentioning, Deneen and Dreyer, and especially in the book I read by Hosny, the Conservatism, a Reappraisal, or Rediscovery, I should say, that's the title, Conservatism and Rediscovery. Yoram Hosny makes the move in there, I believe, of instrumentalizing faith, in his case Judaism, but he also makes the same argument for Christianity, in the service of conservative goals and ideals. We need to be very careful that Christianity is never instrumentalized in becoming a tool for something else. I see this happening a lot in the rhetoric I'm hearing coming out of conservatives today. Christianity is important because it upholds conservatism. And what's wrong here is that Jesus is not the most important thing, and following Christ is not the most important thing, and the gospel proclamation is not the most important thing. What becomes the most important thing is a way of life, or a culture, or values that are important or traditional. Upholding tradition is never the goal. A way of life is never the goal. The goal is proclaiming Christ, bringing the gospel to people, pointing people to the eschatological return of Christ. Anything that instrumentalizes Christianity and makes it less than the most important thing is always problematic. We know that Christ is Lord of all, and on the last day that will be evident to all. In the meantime, we live this side of the return of Christ in this brokenness and in this tension, upholding governments doing their thing, but also knowing that following Christ is the most important thing, and no government is ever going to be able to instrumentalize the church and use it as a tool to uphold its purposes. So that's kind of the bottom line I think we need to have as we consider these things and as we move forward in this political season, thinking about who should get our support, how excited we should be, what's going to be saving America, or what is God doing in the world today. What God is doing is what He has always done. He's holding His creation together, waiting for the day when Christ returns, when all things are fulfilled in Him. And as His servants now, we should be working for both of those things: proclamation of the gospel and an upholding of justice God's way. That's how we live as Christians in this world, in this tension, as we strive to be faithful followers of Christ.